Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Today we are taking up Gate 52 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. So, as you know, we've been stepping through these gates one at a time, one per week. And of course, again, this text comes from another larger text. So we find it in the 12 Fascicle version of Dogen Shobogenzo. He did not actually write this 108 gates. It comes from mostly, it's a big chunk of another text which was set down sort of in the Shobogenzo, and the original text is the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen included this, maybe was going to write some additional commentary on it or something, and never kind of got there. There is a final paragraph that we find after this in the Shobogenzo that sort of recommends that we all investigate these gates quite thoroughly with body and mind. So this is our way to do that. Okay, so today, Gate 52, the gate statement says, the body as an abode of mindfulness is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it all Dharmas are serene. So this week we begin a four-part look at Satipatthana, or the four foundations or four arousings or something of mindfulness. So each of the next four gates is going to take up one aspect or one piece of this thing, body, feeling, mind, and Dharma. So we've got this week and the following three talks to talk about this four foundations of mindfulness. You have probably encountered this in your practice already. This is quite an old teaching, but of course Dogen has a particular take on it, and our Dharma family has a particular take on it, so that's the context for our conversation for the next 4 Sundays. So the Mahasatipatthana Sutra is a main source text for mindfulness practice in the early Buddhist tradition. And it's about methodically cultivating the ability to pay continuous attention to our experience of whatever is happening in this moment by moment. So it's the continuous observance that's important here, because whatever we're paying attention to, of course, is constantly changing. So if we're just sort of diving in and out, that's part of it. But whatever we're applying our mindfulness to is change. So that steady attendance or attention in the midst of change was a good way to develop concentration. It made the mind concentrated, made the mind stable. So also observing the qualities and the characteristics of whatever the object of mindfulness is enabled some insight or some understanding, right? So we have these two kind of things. We have developing this stable concentration, and we have developing some kind of insight. So mindfulness here is seeing all the dharmas as they are in their true nature before we have some personal reaction to them, before we start writing stories about them, right? So this is seeing without making the distinctions that are driven by delusion and three poisonous mind and all of the everything that goes with that. But it's more than just observing external dharmas. It's more than just observing things outside. It's also paying attention to what we're doing and how we're doing it. Remembering to practice, remembering what the Buddha taught, bearing in mind this moment by moment life is our practice. So what did Buddha have to say? What did our teachers have to say? It's considering things like, am I being skillful or not in this moment? Am I making right effort in this moment? Am I staying on the path? Am I getting distracted by craving and aversion and delusion and all of those things? So it supports the ongoing discernment and sort of spirit of inquiry that we have in our moment by moment practice. So mindfulness is important for seeing one reality from two sides, and we know we hear this a lot, right? Seeing this one reality from two sides and taking action that expresses two sides in one action is a central theme for us in the Mahayana, and also for Dogen. If we look at something like the Genjo Koan, it's there all the time. So seeing one reality from two sides, expressing two sides in one action is a central theme. So mindfulness is important for our practice of that. We need to settle into that place where all dharmas are serene, right? Before we poke our heads in and start, lighting the fire. When we're not pulled around by the distractions of the body, the sensations are coming in, the things that we're doing with the body. So we also need to use this body to actively work to liberate beings from suffering. So there's both quiet and activity, right? There's the quiet of paying attention to what's happening and settling. And then there's the activity of using this body to go out in the world and do our bodhisattva work and carry out our bodhisattva vows. So it's easy for us to sort of ignore the body. unless it's making trouble for us, right? We stand, sit, walk, lie down without paying a lot of attention to what happens until we have some pain or until the body won't do what we want it to do. And those of us who are getting older, this is our moment by moment experience, right? We can't do what we did last year or 5 minutes ago. So Kodo Sawaki says, when we're not sick, we forget our bodies. When my legs were strong, I walked and ran, forgetting my feet. Lately, because my legs are getting sick and weak, I begin to appreciate that they're really great things. When we're healthy, we forget our health and just work. When we think of a certain thing, there's usually something wrong with it. When our mind and its objects do not arise, there's nothing special. So Uchiyama Roshi kind of said the same thing in his commentary on the Bendo Wa. So whether he was looking at what Sawaki Roshi had said or whether this was his own sort of experience, he says it's good for your stomach when you forget the existence of the stomach and let it function well. Also, suppose that you have a small injury on the tip of your little finger. The finger you usually forget will suddenly become a big problem. The best condition for all parts of the body is that you forget the existence of the body and let each part function in accordance with necessity in each situation. This is called non-action. Just the ordinary reality of life that has nothing special is best. So here we have a kind of a paradox. Mindfulness of the body has always been an important dharma gate in our Buddhist practice, and yet Sawaki Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi are telling us, well, it's best to forget the body. So there's a paradox we get to carry around, right? So some early Buddhist practice emphasized analysis of things as a way to understand that they are impermanent and that they're kind of unsubstantial. So only conditioned things like the body can be intellectually analyzed. We can't intellectually analyze emptiness, right, or Buddha nature or something. We can only kind of do that practice on things that are conditioned, and the body is one of those things. So we can have ideas about conditioned things. We can describe those things. We can't do any of that with something like awakening, right, or emptiness or pure mind. We can't understand them that way. So the body becomes an important dharma gate in that way. It's something we can study, right, to have some understanding, gain some insight about conditioned things. So we can analyze the parts of the body. We can analyze the sensory inputs that come in through the sense gates. We've talked about those a couple of weeks ago. We can look carefully at the relationships between these elements in order to understand the body and to understand ourselves. But the elements and the relationships will change, of course, because of impermanence. So we can see that the body is not a fixed and permanent self. The body itself is not fixed and permanent, and we can't point to the body and say, this is the self, and that the self will somehow never change. So, we can't analyze our way to understanding emptiness. For that, we need direct experience. So for early Buddhists, when it comes to mindfulness with the body, the initial practice was to pay attention to the breath. Probably we've encountered this somewhere in our reading around or our practice of various Buddhist traditions. The breath, mindfulness of breath has always been important. So, it's not about changing the breathing or doing something with it other than to simply be aware of it. So when breathing in and out with a long or a short breath, to be aware that we're breathing in or breathing out and that the breath is long or short. So then, you do that for a while. Then one was to be aware of the experience of the body when breathing in or out, when the breath was short or the breath was long. So start with the breath, then we expand a bit to what is the experience of the body when breathing is happening and the breath is short or long going in or out. Then to calm the body while breathing, right? So if we're simply sitting, paying attention to breathing, settling happens. The body calms in some way. Then one becomes aware of things that arise and dissolve in the body. So once we're calm enough to pay attention to what's happening, we see some feeling is arising, some feeling is dissolving, something is happening in the body, changing. And finally, one contemplates how the body exists. And we, then give up clinging to the body or anything else. So the body is a place to practice sort of letting go of clinging. We let go of clinging to the body, and of course, then we can let go of clinging to anything else that we encounter. So then we do the same thing when sitting, standing, walking, lying down, right? These are the 4 postures of the body. So if we can pay attention to the body when we're sitting and paying attention to the breath, and then we, sort of expand that awareness, then we can pay attention in a similar way when we're moving through the world, sitting, standing, walking, or lying down. So we know when we're sitting, we know when we're standing, we know when we're walking, we know when we're lying down. We see how the body arises and dissolves, and we can stop clinging. So then, you can do that. You can move on to all of your daily activities. So eating and wearing robes and using the toilet and moving around, somehow we maintain this mindfulness, this awareness of the body. So we're paying attention to those activities and to the impermanence of the body that we can experience through those activities. Then one moves on to contemplating the impurity of the body. And that's done in order to sort of disenchant one's self from the body. So it's about destroying the illusion of beauty, if you will. So these are all ways that we sort of let go of our clinging to the body. So one envisions the body as a bag of skin, containing a collection of bones, muscles, sinews, organs. We'll come back to the whole skin bag thing a little bit later. Or, one might imagine all the fluids in the body. These are not pleasant things. These are not beautiful things, right? Then you imagine the body as a corpse, because, of course, at some point, this body stops living. So you imagine the body as a corpse, the various ways that it decays, the various ways that the bones get scattered around in the graveyard. All this is to break enchantment with the body. So in the early teachings, practicing mindfulness in the body led to achieving the 4 jhanas in Sanskrit, or jhanas in Pali, and we've run into these a little bit here. These are 4 stages toward, moving towards understanding the true nature of reality and reaching nirvana. So they mark a shift away from this sort of outward world of the senses toward a sort of an inward contemplation. So the first of these stages is detachment from the external world and becoming aware of a feeling of joy and ease that permeates the body. So the second is a concentration that lets go of our sort of intellectual investigation of things. It's a different kind of investigation. The third is that this joy that arises in the body starts to dissolve, and only this feeling of ease remains. And the fourth is that the ease also dissolves, and it just leaves this equanimity. So the bodhisattva goes through these 4 stages in the early teachings. Then there are, when you get to that point, there are further kinds of spiritual exercises having to do with contemplating infinity and contemplating the unreality of things, and then even letting go of that, right? So we see this progression toward letting go, letting go, letting go, letting go. Disenchantment with the body and with the things that we cling to in the external world, and even with our thinking, right? Even with our ideas about things like infinity. So the Buddha said that developing mindfulness in the body was a sort of a first line of defense, if you will, against Mara, or against delusion, because it results in skillfulness that comes from clear insight, from clear knowing. So he gives a lot of examples that compare someone without mindfulness in the body to something that can't withstand invasion, right? So if you throw a heavy rock, he says, if you throw a heavy rock into a pile of wet clay, of course it goes into that clay easily, while if you throw a ball of lightweight string against a heavy wooden door, of course, it just bounces off. Or if you pour water into an empty water pot, the water goes in easily, where if you have a pot that's already full, of course, additional water is just going to spill out. So he gives these pictures of sort of impermeability, right? If you have mindfulness in the body, somehow delusion can't make its way in. So if all that isn't enough, then Buddha says there are 10 benefits to practicing mindfulness in the body. And here we go. Hang on. Okay. One is going beyond displeasure and delight. So, we're kind of not picking and choosing. 2 is going beyond fear and dread. 3 is enduring unpleasant bodily feelings. So things like cold, hunger, bug bites, hurtful language, various kinds of physical pains and discomforts. 4th is attaining at will these 4 stages, these 4 jhanas, or heightened sort of mental states. 5th is having supernormal powers, like appearing and disappearing, or walking through walls or flying through the air. So 6th is hearing both human and divine sounds, whether far or near, so you have clairaudience, right? 7 is being able to read minds, and knowing when someone has experienced craving and aversion, or, sort of delusion and awareness, or distraction and concentration. 8th is remembering your previous lives and the circumstances around your previous lives. 9th is seeing people's karma and the conditions of their rebirth, why they were reborn in this particular way, and maybe how they'll be reborn in the future. And 10th is existing in pure awareness. So all of these things, Buddha says, will come from mindfulness of the body. So this isn't an approach that we particularly take at Sanshin. We don't guarantee anybody's going to fly through the air or walk through walls or read people's minds if you sit down and do zazen. So, in fact, Dogen had some pretty harsh words, really, for people who were trying to regulate themselves with these kinds of practices. However, he is completely in favor of knowing when a long breath is long and a short breath is short. So there is a connection. This is not a complete disconnect. He is certainly in favor of awareness of what's happening here. He specifically mentions long breath and short breath, right? So he takes a little bit of a different approach to this thing, but understanding the early foundations of this and the practice is kind of useful and important. So, of course, being Dogen, it's not as simple as just knowing when the long breath is long and the short breath is short. He also says that his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, taught that whether the breath is short or long, it doesn't come from anywhere and it doesn't go to anywhere. Therefore, there's no actual distinction between long and short. So once we know the breath is long or short, then we even let go of knowing that, because that's Dogen, right? That's what he does. So anyway, our practice is not about withdrawing from the world. It's not about sort of disengaging from the senses and not being engaged with the world around us. It's about seeing how samsara and nirvana are not separate. So, we learn how to be completely engaged in what's happening without losing sight of the true nature of reality. So without getting caught up in our own stuff and whatever the body might be throwing at us, right? We get to see the true nature of reality and understand that samsara and nirvana are not different. There's nowhere we're trying to go. We're not trying to escape from this body to get to somewhere else or to get to a better condition or something like that. This body is it, right? This is the ground of our practice. But we can certainly identify with becoming aware of physical sensation and seeing how we write the self-involved story around what's going on with the body, right? That part we can certainly identify with. So we can pay attention to how our own body is impermanent and how in this body we are connected to everything. So interconnection is there, and see how that applies to everything else that we encounter. So again, this body is a wonderful ground of practice. Observing what happens in the body teaches us some things, right? That we can understand are also true of the rest of the world and the other dharmas that we encounter. So we become intimate with the body as a ground of our practice. We sort of can't ignore the body. And as somebody who lives in my head, I've got to tell you, body practice is tough for me. I am inclined to ignore the body, with sometimes some unfolding consequences, right? We need to be intimate with the body as the ground of the practice, which makes it a wonderful dharma gate for investigating Buddha's teachings. Zazen is a body practice. If you sing Baika, that's a body practice, right? Just, inhabiting this body and going through the world using this body and mind to carry out bodhisattva vows is in itself a terrific dharma gate. So Uchiyama Roshi says, this self is not some fixed body. It's constantly changing. Every time we take a breath, we're changing. Our consciousness is always changing too. All the chemical and physical processes in our body are also constantly changing, and yet everything temporarily takes a form. This is our true self. So right in this body, we get to investigate, well, there's a form, we can touch this body. This body feels like it's permanent from moment to moment, and yet we know if we sit zazen, we become aware this constantly changing. Something's constantly changing, and yet there's a form, right? So it's a really interesting thing to investigate. So by paying attention to the body, we get to see firsthand how we live in the middle of both form and emptiness. It's right here. We don't have to go somewhere else to experience that or practice with that. So this body is real, and yet we know it's also a collection of 5 skandhas that come together for a little while and then dissolve. So if the body is not separate from the rest of the Buddha way, then this is a really important part of our practice, right? We can't leave out the body from our practice. And of course, we have to pay attention to what the body is doing in the world, because it's one of the 3 places we create karma, right? Body, speech, and mind. So, really important. Body is really important as a dharma gate. So in opening the hand of thought, Uchiyama Roshi makes the point that even though awakening is already here, we often live kind of blindly. We get caught up in our thoughts. We think that our thoughts are the only reality. The stories that we write, we think are the only reality. So our job as practitioners is to determine how to live in the midst of all of that in a wholesome way. To recognize that we're writing the stories. The stories are real in their way, but it's not the entire picture. So we get to sort of live in the midst of all of that. So Uchiyama Roshi says the important thing is to find a sane way to live out the reality of life. This is what a true spiritual practice is about. Not spirit or mind separated from the body and the world, but a true way of life. This is what Zazen is, a practice of living out the fresh reality of life. So we can see in our Zazen that we take the posture and we appear to be sitting completely still, but at the same time, we're breathing in and out. We have long breaths and short breaths, and blood is flowing, and the organs are doing what the organs are doing. We're making micro adjustments to the posture all the time just in order to stay upright. It's kind of like when you drive a car and you're constantly steering a little bit. We look like we're not moving, but we know we're constantly shifting a little bit, moving a little bit. So there is form and emptiness, and there is stillness and activity, and it's all right in the midst of this moment of sitting zazen. So we get to be personally aware of all of that and have a direct experience of that in a way that might be more difficult when we're moving through the world and we're having to make distinctions and discriminations and take actions and do some things. When we sit in zazen with this body and mind, then we get to experience all of that. So if we fast forward from the early teachings to the early teachings in India to 13th century Japan and our friend Dogen, we see that the 4 foundations of mindfulness were actually quite important to him. He wrote about them in several places, and we can look at 2 discourses today from the Eihei Koroku where he particularly talks about 4 foundations of mindfulness. So in the first one, he says, although people in the past who left the world to become teachers said that the body and mind of ancient Buddhas become attached to grasses and trees, they never said that mindfulness of body, sensations, minds, and phenomena are the eyeballs of the ancestral teachers. So ancient Buddhas becoming attached to grasses and trees means that they appeared in the world to liberate us and to liberate all beings from suffering. So Dogen says that while early teachers did that, these Buddhas did manifest on the earth, they didn't say that the 4 foundations of mindfulness are the very stuff of these Buddhas. So mindfulness of these 4 things is itself Buddha, or is itself awakening, right? So that's a shift from doing sort of a body-based mindfulness practice in order to gradually achieve this goal of not clinging to the body. And eventually to stop clinging then to anything else in the world. So Dogen is saying again here that practice and awareness are not separate from, practice and awareness are not separate from awakening, right? Simply paying attention is awakening itself. So we aren't practicing in order to get a reward later on. Being mindfulness of the body, being mindful of the body within the body is itself awakening. It is itself Buddha. So again, although people in the past who left the world to become teachers said that the body and mind of ancient Buddhas become attached to grasses and trees, they never said that mindfulness of body, sensations, minds, and phenomena are the eyeballs of the ancestral teachers, right? So early teachers were talking about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and Dogen is saying that's not something to do in order to get somewhere. That practice is itself awakening. So Uchiyama Roshi frequently talked about this thing we're calling life force, the thing that he called life force, which is the complete functioning of reality in this moment, right? Somehow the universe doing exactly what the universe does. He sometimes called this thing life force. So he talked about how we need to live out this true reality from within this body and mind. So being aware of this life force living out whatever it's doing from within this body and mind. So that means that we recognize that there's something more to our lives than being individuals inside individual bodies. The reality is we're individuals inside these bodies, and also there's something additionally happening here. So Uchiyama Roshi says, the force that makes my heart beat sends blood flowing through my whole body and allows me to breathe so many times per minute. It is not something that I created or activated, that I control or activate. The power that performs these functions works completely beyond my thoughts. Can we say this power is not me because it comes from beyond my thinking mind? It is neither a higher power nor some other power, nor is it my personal self-power. It is the energy of life. So, the other Dogen discourse we can look at for today is this one. Our Buddha, Shakyamuni, said to his disciples, there are 4 foundations of mindfulness on which people should depend. These 4 foundations of mindfulness refer to contemplating the body as impure, contemplating sensation as suffering, contemplating mind as impermanent, and contemplating phenomena as non-substantial. I, Eihei, also have 4 foundations of mindfulness. Contemplating the body as a skin bag, contemplating sensation as eating bowls, contemplating mind as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, and contemplating phenomena as old manjiang, drinking wine, and old man Lee getting drunk. Great Assembly, are my 4 foundations of mindfulness the same or different from the ancient Buddha's 4 foundations of mindfulness? If you say they are the same, your eyebrows will fall out from lying. If you say they are different, you will lose your body and life. So, because he's talking about all 4 foundations, we'll come back to these when we'll come back to that piece of text as we talk about each of the other 3. So we're going to hear that text again several more times. So for today, Buddha's contemplating the body as impure and Dogen's contemplating the body as a skin bag. So the pattern for each of these things is that Dogen takes the Buddha's conclusion about whatever it is and replaces it with a concrete example of emptiness, if you will, if that's possible, right? So Buddha says the body is impure, so that practitioners will work on letting go of attachment to the body. He says, contemplate the body as impure. It's where the 3 poisons spring from. So consider that the body is not a beautiful thing. It's not a permanent thing. It's not the self. Let go of it. He says it's full of nasty, smelly stuff. It gets sick and it dies. The physical sensations that arise from the body set off the whole 12-fold chain. Clinging to the body is a real hindrance if you're trying to get to nirvana. So Dogen says the body is simply a collection of bones and organs, and it's contained within our skin. So we don't have to mortify it or ignore it or view it as impure or view it as anything. We don't have to have an opinion, that kind of opinion about it in order to achieve a goal that's like somewhere else or at some other time. So in fact, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, Dogen considers the sense organs and the things that arises from sense organs to be instances of prajna or instances of wisdom. So he's not seeing impurity here, he's seeing wisdom here. So he's turning that around, kind of turning on its head. So he says, the body is simply the body. Yes, clinging to the body is not helpful, but we don't, need to consider that it is impure in any particular way. It's part of this one unified reality. It's not outside of Buddha's way. It's not something we need to get rid of. We just need to see it clearly, right? We need to see it with wisdom and experience it with wisdom. So rather than thinking, skin bag, not pretty, corpses are unpleasant, blah, he says the body is just as it is. Body is beyond what we think about it. When we see it through the eyes of Buddha, we don't need to get stuck in ideas about purity and impurity. We can see the body as it is for what it is. So we can just pay attention to what the body is doing and what we're doing with the body and see the impermanence and see the interconnection. And that's enough, right? So recognizing the body as a ground of our practice is really important. This gate statement says that mindfulness of the body allows us to settle down in equanimity because all dharmas are serene, as the gate statement says. So when we encounter or experience things, we recognize that information is coming in through the sense gates. We're having some perception of whatever it is that we're encountering. We're forming opinions and judgments and stories about those sensations, and then we're taking action, and we're creating karma based on taking that action. So, we can see clearly what's happening and maybe not get quite so swept away by it, right? We need to take in sense information. We need to use the body, to carry out the vows, but we don't have to get stuck there. So when we see clearly what's happening with the body, then, we can keep from getting caught up in hindrances. And that includes both attachment to the body and also hatred for the body, right? Craving and aversion are 2 sides of the same thing. So there's this whole thing about being attached to the body, but somehow, maybe especially in these modern times, body image is a big part of our identity. We can really have some difficult feelings about the body, right? So it's difficult to see the body as it is. We kind of only see the stories about the body because it's so closely tied up to who we think we are and who we'd like others to think that we are, right? So, things would be better if only I was thinner, or I was better looking, or my back didn't hurt, or my knees didn't bother me, or something, right? Things would be great if only I could change the body somehow. Or, geez, I'm really good looking and healthy, and so I'm better than other people. I need to go all out to protect my looks, my health, whatever, or else maybe I'm no good. Maybe I have no merit. If I'm young and beautiful, boy, I don't want to lose that, because people see that and I see their reactions to that. And there's, a certain amount of positive reinforcement around that, right? when I look at, myself when I was 25, and then I look at this, I go, that's pretty different. I used to work in television, right? I mean, I was on camera doing the makeup and the earrings and the whole thing. And now I look at this and think, wow, that's talk about impermanence. I'm fine with that, but it's really interesting what we consider about the body and how we might have some positive or negative feelings about that. But when we have a clear view of the body, then we're in a much better position to take some skillful action, or maybe not to perpetuate unskillful action or perpetuate suffering. So, for instance, Dogen said to people who were serving as the tenzo or the cook in the temple, rejoice in your birth into the world where you are capable of using your body freely to offer food to the three treasures. Wow. He's saying, rejoice in the fact that you have this human form, because in this human form, you can practice. You can make offerings. You can do your bodhisattva vows. You can carry wholesomeness in the world. If you're born into any of the other 5 realms of samsara, that's kind of not possible, right? This human form is where we get to take action and practice. So we pay attention to the body, not to withdraw from the world again, but to go out and be bodhisattvas, right? So in order to do that, we need to see everything as ourselves. We really deeply need to see interconnection. What part of this world is not part of my body? And that's kind of a tough practice, because there's things out there we'd like to ignore or would like to not think are part of our own experience or our own existence, or that we're not responsible for, right? So in other words, we need to see that our bodies are not separate from anything, and that the body functions together with the entire universe. So this life force that Uchiyama Roshi was talking about, not separate from this body, right? There's no part of that we can draw a line and say, that's not me. And yet we look around and say, we want to have some fixed and permanent identity. So this is a real paradox for us. So Uchiyama Roshi says, when we really get that mind and object are one, that there's no separation, then everything we encounter in our lives functions as part of our bodies, right? Everything is hands and eyes. Everything we encounter is part of our own existence and part of our own functioning. So where does the body begin and end? That's an interesting thing to consider. Where does my body begin and where does my body end? At what point is there separation? So mindfulness of the body means mindfulness of all dharmas. Seeing and carrying out all of our activities as though everything was a part of our bodies is a description of samadhi. It's a description of awakening, right? We really see with Buddha's eye this non-separation. In a sort of a concrete way, we can say, well, we breathe air in and out. There's we're exchanging air, moisture comes and goes, we eat food and have to get rid of the waste products, and I mean, clearly we're not separate from the world. So in a very day-to-day concrete way, that's one way to contemplate that. But also we know there's a broader perspective which says there was never a boundary to begin with, right? There was never a distinction to be made. So if we can see this way, then all of our actions with the body are practice, right? Everything we do is both an offering and a chance to go through this Dharma gate and study something, right? So everything we do with this body is an offering to the three treasures, is an offering to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and also, so it's kind of going outward, but also for us, we get a chance to study something. We get a chance to learn something and have some insight. So in the training temple, there are gathas, or short verses, that we have for many of the activities of just daily life, the simple things we do every single day. There's a little 4-line gatha which we can chant to maintain mindfulness, to pay attention to what we're doing. So it's everything from using the toilet, shaving your head, taking a bath, waking up in the morning, eating a meal. There's like no basic activity of the day that doesn't have a little gatha that you can say when you do that. So the form of these gathas is to name the activity and then say, I vow with all beings, and then there's some relevant aspiration, right? Sometimes a play on words that goes with whatever this activity is. So for instance, for washing your face, washing the face, I vow with all beings to attain the pure Dharma gate and be forever undefiled. So whenever you're washing something, there's always something about being undefiled or letting go of something, right? Or if you're brushing your teeth, brushing the teeth in the morning, I vow with all beings to care for the eye teeth that bite through all afflictions. So now we're talking about wisdom, right? Eye teeth of wisdom. Sometimes I think it's translated that way. I've seen it, eye teeth of wisdom. So these are helpful reminders to pay attention to what we're doing with the body, to see those activities as practice and to see those activities as offerings. How would it be if when we were washing our face or, waking up in the morning or, brushing your teeth, that became an offering to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? What a interesting way to live, and what a support system, right, for your practice. At what point are we not practicing? And the body is a great way to kind of stay in that mind. So doing formal meals using oryoki is another good example. Some of us here have done those kind of formal meals. We have, a set of 3, 4, 5 bowls. We lay them out in a particular way. There's some chants that we do. Food is served in a particular way. We eat in a particular way. We wash those bowls in a particular way and wrap them back up. So it is a complete practice of mindfulness during a meal. But really, all of our forms are about behaving with dignity or behaving with decorum with this body. Why? So we're paying attention to what we're doing, maintaining awareness of what we're doing and the effect of what we're doing on other people. All right, this body, what we do with this body, has an effect on others. So it's one way of how we maintain harmony in the Sangha, right? So the dignity and the decorum of the body helps us to pay attention to what am I doing? And it's really kind of tied up with our approach to forms. In this Dharma family, we keep our forms simple so that we understand what we're doing and why, and that our action is arising from the mind of Zazen, right? So all these little forms that we do, simple gasho, all the way up to, doing an entire hosenshiki or big ceremony, the behaving with dignity and decorum and the way we're doing forms is not so that we can be rigid, or that I do the form better than you and therefore I'm a better person or something like that, right? It's about mindfulness. It's about paying attention to what am I doing with the body and how am I doing that in the context of Sangha? How is there harmony in the Sangha because we're bowing together or we're at least doing the same thing, whatever the Dharma position is. When I come to my cushion, I bow to my cushion, right? There's something there that builds Sangha. There's a shared experience of practicing with the body, which is a lot of what ritual is about anyway, right? Bowing together, right? Eating a meal formally together, chanting together, all of that use of the body is really about practicing together with the body, right? And building some community shared experience and some community spirit. So Dogen wrote a book on forms and regulations in the training temple because these things are important Dharma gates. The Eihei Shingi is nothing but regulations and forms for how do we function in the training temple. And of course, we read it today as modern Western householders, and we rightly understand that the things that he's talking about are not confined only to the temple. I mean, he's talking quite specifically about, how do you function as an officer in a temple. But of course, we take that same body practice approach out into whatever it is we're doing, right? We're paying attention to whatever it is we're doing. So if we're eating a meal formally in the temple, that's good. But if we're eating around the table with our family, we can have kind of the same approach, right? If we're taking care of the Sangha, that's fine. If we're taking care of the family, same approach, right? So being in a training temple is about paying attention with body and mind. It's not about intellectual learning. It's about practicing the daily tasks of living in the temple with the other people who are there, taking care of the temple, the practice, the visitors, right? And learning with body and mind. By actively doing something, we're learning with body and mind. So it's about not getting lost in thought and sort of forgetting about the real stuff of our lives. If I'm hitting the umpan or ringing the bell, I need to be right there with that, understanding what the body is doing with that. Not in an intellectual way. Oh, gee, I'm ringing the bell, therefore I'm in charge and I'm important, or whatever the thought is that goes with that. So, of course, we can do that wherever we are. Doesn't have to be in the temple. There's always an opportunity to practice this serenity and equanimity by paying attention to the body, what's happening in the body and what the body is doing. So it's a chance not only to have a personal experience of settling down with the body in this moment, but also to bring peace to others, I think, by being aware of what's coming in through the body and being aware of our actions going out into the world. So what would you like to say about mindfulness of the body, practice with the body? We've talked about several ways to think about that today. So what arises for you? Or Doju, do you have anything you want to add? Because sometimes you have interesting, useful things for us to consider.
I don't know if I have anything specific today, at least not yet. So.
Okay, this gate was actually pretty straightforward. I was able to get through this one on my own. But as we go forward and we do the other three gates, we'll be circling back. What would other people like to say? Questions, reflections, things that arise for you, things to share? And don't forget to unmute yourself if you have something to say so we can hear you. Hosshin, please.
I like to think of this in the historical context of the Buddha, thinking about the Buddha, Bodhidharma, people who sat down and actually observed what was going on with them. Not necessarily the first ones, but to notice the flower coming up and then going away. Noticing that impermanence, understanding that it's the same impermanence that our bodies are. So to think about how we practice. Years ago, I did a stint in Alaska at a fish camp.
Ooh.
And I tried to sit every day. And it was really hard because we would put in 12-hour days. And so I'd have to do it in the morning or at noon or something like that. And what I wanted to try and do was keep sitting at the same time every day, because then you notice the difference between what you were like the day before. And so you carry that into you, meld it with your Dharma and make it part of practice. So
that's an interesting take on that consistency. When we teach people to sit Zazen, we frequently say, if you can figure out how to sit the same time every day, that consistency is helpful, because when you get to the cushion, it's like your body knows, okay, it's time to sit because I sit this time every day. But what you're mentioning is really interesting, because now you get to see change. I sat, at 6 a.m. and then the next day I sat at 6 a.m. and then how was that different? And the next day I sat at 6 a.m. and how was that different? That's really interesting. What an interesting Dharma gate, right? What a great way to really directly notice impermanence. Because you do feel different if you sit at 6 a.m. and then you sit at 5 p.m. and then the next day you sit at in the afternoon, and it's a different time of day and the light is different and your body feels different. So if you sit the same time every day, that's a useful study. Yeah. Alaska. Wow.
yeah.
Eido was also in Alaska for a while, so we've got some Alaska folks here.
Oh yeah.
What would others like to say?
Do you have the numbers of the Eihei Koroku excerpts for the day? Those are you finding all the good Eihei Koroku cuts. So.
Good. Yes, I do. So the first one is discourse number 284. It's page 270 of Hojo-san's translation. And the second one is discourse number 310, and it's on 287 of Hojo-san's translation. And that one, as I say, we'll be coming back to for the next three talks, because he talks about all four foundations, and we need to talk about each one. So if anybody wants to find that, dig it up and put it in front of you for the next three talks, that's just fine. It's a bit long, so it might be helpful to read it.
I guess I could add one thing about the kind of language here. So strangely, in the text that, the text that's supposed to be from the Shobogenzo that I have, that's, the Sino-Japanese, it doesn't have this one. And I think probably the text is just messed up, but it's still, because it's like an online source, but it does have 108 gates even without that one. So, but I looked at the, text that it's drawn from, and it is there. So I can't tell if there's actually some kind of redaction that went on in Dogen's version, because it gets translated in, the various English things. So I think it's probably just the text that's messed up. But at any rate, the word that's used for tranquility, can be interpreted in a number of ways. And the translation from the same source text in Tibetan, they translate it instead as physical isolation instead of all dharma. What is it in the
All
Nishijima?
All dharmas are serene.
Serene, yeah. So instead of serene, they say physical isolation.
Interesting.
And I think that has to do with the idea from early Buddhism and When you're reaching these different dhyana states, you're kind of, sort of like blocking out essentially like different sensory inputs and so forth. So it gives you this sensation of being physically isolated. But also the same word can be used as a synonym for nirvana, which fits very well with Dogen's idea of saying that practice and awakening are one. So it's kind of interesting that you can take it both in kind of a early Buddhist way and a Mahayana Buddhist way. So.
Oh, that's interesting. So it makes me wonder, was Dogen looking at that and developing his own take on it? So that's interesting. 108 gates. Interestingly, I think if you look at the Nishijima cross, there are 109 because there's one that's like repeated or something. So I'm not surprised that even missing number 52, you still have 108. So, if you want to get into the technicalities of this, I think I'm kind of not surprised by that. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so you can really see the shift there in the early teachings about withdrawing, physical isolation, really pulling back from, and you can see how that has shifted completely by the time we get to Dogen. Because to me, this is like a really big, important shift. It's a complete shift to say, no, we're not pulling back from the world. We're 100% in the world and seeing clearly enough that we're not getting stuck. So we're not getting stuck by not being connected, right? We're not getting stuck by seeing clearly and not getting stuck. So, it's not better or worse, but I think it's a real change from early so when we look at early teachings, that's important, that's helpful, and we also have to know that there's a shift. If you read the early things, as Doju's pointing out, you can read it in a certain way and you think, why is, then I read other things and they feel like completely different. So I think we have to be careful. Again, I frequently warn people or encourage folks, when you're reading something, make sure you know where it's coming from, because it can be really confusing. These things can shift, quite a bit over time and space. Other things people would like to say? Questions, reflections, please. I think I saw Jeff and then Mark.
So I was going to ask about this shifting, and I don't quite understand the spirit of it. I mean, the writings and the words seem so, people are so mindful about it and so accurate and precise, and then to have these shifts that are almost antithetical. Can you say something general about how that was done and regarded, and or is it very, very gradual and now it looks sudden? Or
well, I think it's more gradual than sudden, because there are early teachings and then the Mahayana comes along and starts to shift those things, and then someone like Dogen comes along and shifts them more. So, I mean, we're looking at like really early Buddhist stuff, and then suddenly we're looking at 13th century Japan, and I didn't do anything with the middle of this, right? So it looks like all of a sudden, bang, there's this big shift, but I think it happens kind of gradually. And Doju, please jump in if you have some additional information. We can compare two things across space and time and they can look quite different, but I think that shift happens, when you consider Buddhism moved along the Silk Road, encountered a lot of other things, a lot of time went by, and now we've got someone like Dogen who takes everything and turns it on its head. So it's useful to me when I'm looking at the early teachings to see what there is still a connection. He's still talking about 4 foundations of mindfulness. In fact, he's talking about ancient Buddhas and 4 foundations of mindfulness. And yet he's sort of pulling it forward and saying, and here's this other way to think about that. Yeah, that's true. And if you think about the way Dogen writes, he doesn't write a word that's not about non-duality, right? I mean, everything about Dogen is about non-separation. So it's kind of a logical approach when you consider that's coming from him. He's looking at 4 foundations of mindfulness and going, now, how do we think about that in terms of non-duality? Well, it's true we can pay attention to this body, and then it's also true that there's no separation between this body and anything else. So it's kind of a logical progression, but I think it takes some time. Doju, do you have anything you want to add to that? Because you've been looking at the earlier stuff.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the shift from early Buddhism to Mahayana Buddhism. And probably especially, with Nagarjuna, who wrote the Fundamental Verses of the Middle Way, which is this really important text. in which he sort of is trying to like prove the validity of emptiness, basically, probably like against Buddhists who reject the idea of it. And one of the things that he says that becomes a really famous phrase in that is that there is, no separation at all between nirvana and samsara, which is really provocative for early Buddhists because, of course, they couldn't be farther apart. And that's the whole point of Buddhism, is to leave samsara and get to nirvana. So to say that they're the same sounds kind of crazy. And a lot of, I think, the later development of Mahayana Buddhism is sort of taking that idea and running with it. And Dogen's equation of practice and awakening is another sort of version of that, you might say. So yeah, I think that kind of shift has a lot to do with it. And this idea here, again, is another. So the two ways you might interpret this phrase of saying that, mindfulness of the body is physical isolation versus is awakening, or is another expression of the difference between, early Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, I think.
Yeah, and I think you really see the pattern. No, I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that? When I think about it, I'll come back. Mark had his hand up, and I think Eido also. Mark, how did you want to jump in?
I wanted to jump in by saying, in the before time, this would have been a really great place to suggest, being a jisha, being a doan, volunteering. These are good forms of body practice. I've recently started to try because what you're doing is really paying attention to your body. And when you first start out, you have this idea of what it means to be a jisha, or what it means to hit the bell. And every time you mess up, you keep reinforcing that idea. And when you eventually let go of the idea and let the body hit the bell, just be the bell, it all starts to come together. But at the same time, you still have to be present and pay attention. It's very difficult to chant and be the chant, but also you have to know where you are on that line. And recently I've, as a hobby, because I have tons of time to kill, no more commute times, I've started doing Shakyo for the Heart Sutra, but I'm using a calligraphy book for the Heart Sutra, where they map it out. And the first thing I noticed is it's a body practice. You just focusing on breath, not brushstroke. So yeah, so once we start meeting back together again, this would be a good gate to take up and volunteer.
Thank you for that. Shakyo, absolutely a body practice in the way that Baiko is a body practice. Absolutely right. So if you're, doing a practice position, that is also an important Dharma gate for paying attention to the body. I remembered what I was going to say about what Doju said. The pattern that you see changing is from linearity to non-linearity. So in the early texts, we see do this and do this and do this and get to nirvana or get something outside of this moment where, one of the big shifts you see by the time you get to our Dharma family is there's nowhere to go. I see that as a kind of a larger pattern. Eido, did you want to jump in? I thought I saw hands up for you.
Just briefly, I wanted to respond to what Hosshin said and also apologize for being late because I got my time zones mixed up. I'll have to get that straightened out. But when you were talking about sitting at the same time every day, that was a new idea, the thing that you're bringing this new self with you every day. But what I thought you were going to say, and what it also could happen is, the environment is also changing, particularly the light. At the same, if you do it at the same time every day, and so it's kind of like, in a way, you're sort of moving. You're with the movement of the universe in a way, because you're on the same cycle. Because the not only are you, but also the environment at the same time is different. that was all my little contribution.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because when I sit in the mornings, I sit looking out my front window and I'm facing the sunrise. And so I really notice, like when we go on and off of daylight savings time, it's like, wait a minute, where's the sun? Oh, wait a minute, the sun is back, right? And you do feel like if you sit every day at that same time, you do feel like I'm part of something larger than me, right? I mean, the universe is functioning not separate from me. It's functioning through this body and mind. So it's a really helpful practice. Did I see other hands? What does that say? Doju, please.
I had one other thing that I wanted to add to Jeff's question, because you mentioned the sort of precision of the statements made in early Buddhism. And so, yeah, this is sort of an interesting problem for later Buddhists, because, the early things were supposed to be said by the Buddha, so they couldn't contradict them. So that's why you get all these kind of reinterpretations rather than kind of rejections. So, there's a tendency to say what he really meant was, this, even though it looks like he said that. Or, a kind of thing where that was just a teaching for, stupid people, and like the true teaching is this thing that was revealed to me or whatever. So yeah, that's another aspect of what's going on.
Thank heaven for upaya, right? Thank heaven for skillful means. Because of course we got to be careful about that, right? Because it's so easy to interpret things the way we want to interpret them and say, oh, it's because of skillful means, right? It's because he was talking to a different group and now we have to, right? So yeah, that's a tricky road.
Yeah, and I think for us as modern people, at least for me, it's important just to remember that, to me, it doesn't really matter who said what, like if the Buddha, really said it or not. To me, it's just sort of what works in our lives, so it might be one or the other thing.
Sure. Well, and, what comes out of our direct experience, not our opinion, right? But what comes out of our direct experience, because we know a lot of this practice is we sit down and verify. We sit down and say, what is the true reality of this moment? And, then it doesn't really matter who said it. If it's the true reality of this moment, that's enough. Other thoughts this morning? Sawyer, please.
Hi. I in sort of, first of all, thank you. That talk was just really full for me. It felt like it touched every corner. And in thinking about this sort of development of Buddhism from a kind of linearity, almost a goal-oriented approach, to this kind of it's all already here approach. And I'm feeling like there's sort of another development happening in a sense of looking at the mindfulness movement, Thich Nhat Hanh, and mindfulness movement as sort of paying direct attention to joy and delight, and sort of the goodness of being alive, and having an actual. So I wonder where that sense of things, and maybe this comes up a lot here, but that sense of things relates to, what Dogen was saying, or what our Dharma family points to.
Well, we've talked here about, and I can't remember which gate, it was a previous gate, that, when we are seeing clearly and moving through the world in a wholesome way, equanimity, settledness, joy arises naturally. And this is not a joy that comes from getting all of our needs met. All right. This is not about satisfying all of our ego-driven needs. This is a broader joy, which, as you've said, might be something like it's good to be alive, right? We can appreciate this moment in particular ways, which don't have anything to do with this kind of short-term craving. I want things and I need them, and there are things I don't want, and right? I mean, that's kind of the three poison driven stuff. There's a joy which is underneath that, which sometimes we call contentment. We do get to experience that if we pay attention to what's happening. I think the challenge for us, though, is as modern Western people, we want a quick fix. We want to read something or read the Facebook meme or put the poster on the wall or whatever it is and feed the inner child and say, well, I'm going to convince myself that certain things are true so that I can be happy. That's not what our practice is about. It's not about convincing ourselves of something. It's about sitting down, having an experience of, direct experience of reality and seeing through the delusion, the craving, the chasing, the running away, and finding our contentment there, which is different than what we typically do. Typically, I'm running after the chocolate cake, right? Or I'm running away from, something I don't like. So it might not feel like when we start to practice, it might not feel like there's any joy or contentment that's just already there. It feels like I've got to work really hard in my life to get things or be somebody I like better or whatever it is, and things will be better if things would be good if only, right? So to have some trust that if we practice, if we see clearly, and that includes seeing our suffering. Seeing that we are connected to everything, whether we like those things or not, having some faith that under all of that, there is joy and contentment is kind of a big deal. It's kind of a leap because especially this year, a lot of us are not content. A lot of us are suffering mightily in some pretty deep fundamental ways, right? So it really doesn't feel like that's true. We can read these teachings and go, okay, but that's just somebody saying, don't worry, be happy. What does that mean for me? Well, that means we get to sit down, right? So paying attention to things with an eye to experiencing contentment can be a wonderful thing, but we need to really not get stuck because we can start telling ourselves even stories about that. I'm going to eat this orange and pay attention to texture, smell, taste, all that stuff, because I'm going to deeply appreciate this orange. Well, what if I do that mindfulness exercise and I just think, well, this is an orange? It's like, have I failed? Like, where do I find the contentment in those practices? So those practices are not bad, but we need to go beyond even clinging to that and saying mindfulness is more than, it is paying attention to what am I doing in this moment, but it's more than that. It's remembering, what did the Buddha teach? It's remembering that this moment is practice, that all of my activity with body, speech, and mind is practice. That's what we're mindfulness, and Doju could help me deconstruct that word. It's about now and heart, the kanji, now and heart. So I'm putting my heart mind into right now, but it's more than just saying I'm going to pay very close attention to how I put my fork and my knife on the table. It's remembering, oh, Buddha taught some things and there's practice happening and there's something here beyond me, and right, that's what we're bearing in mind. So there's more than one way to look at that. And if we're truly bearing in mind each of our, each moment, everything we're doing is practice, there is a level of contentment there, which we can sort of rest on or sink into in a particular way. So, I would just say in the West, we want to grab something like mindfulness and we want to use it for something. Mindfulness is not about using it for something. It's simply about mindfulness, right? So there's nowhere else to go. We need to not be looking for the cash payout on mindfulness. And then I think sometimes we kind of want to do that. Do others want to comment on that or have other things to say? Mark, please.
Yeah, I've sat with this for a bit as well. The one thing that I use that's been very helpful is mindfulness reinforces the self, and practice reinforces emptiness and the relationship of emptiness. So when you're focusing on that orange and you're focusing on the good things, you're reinforcing what you are. Whereas as you practice, you are seeing your relationship with everybody. And the emphasis is not on you. The emphasis is on the relationship and the emptiness the joyful emptiness that brings.
Well, it's certainly possible to eat the orange or place the fork, and to do that as a practice in which we let go of self. There's simply, an orange being eaten rather than it's all about me. But that's more difficult, right? Because sometimes we fall into that. It's all about my experience of something, and then that does reinforce itself. So, we just have to be careful, right? We just have to be careful.
And mindfulness is a good first step too, because I mean, in our busy day-to-day lives, we don't notice that orange. We don't notice what we have.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but yeah, it's a very good first step.
It is, and like all practices, we simply have to pay attention to what we're doing with it, right? There's nothing wrong with mindfully eating an orange, as long as we're paying attention to how we're mindfully eating an orange, right? We get to keep peeling that onion. What would others like to say? Other thoughts about the body? Doju, please.
I just could quickly add about mindfulness, because you mentioned the original kind of meaning of the word. In the Sanskrit, it's a smriti, which refers to like remembering. So the modern idea of it being about sort of just this kind of pure awareness is a pretty modern idea. That's not actually how it was used historically. And it does have much more of this sense of keeping something in mind while doing something. So, being aware of what the Buddha taught as you go about your life or something. That's not to say that, having pure awareness isn't a good thing or anything, but it is interesting that the meaning of the word has kind of shifted, and especially in sort of the popular consciousness of the past, 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. When I go around talking about mindfulness means we remember what Buddha taught, people look at me like, what? That's a new idea. Iris, did you want to jump in? I see your camera's on.
Sure. I was just going to bring up, maybe not surprisingly, for me, working in the garden is a big body practice for me. And I always find it really interesting because, people always end up associating, beauty and aesthetics, in conversations about working in, for me, like, not a vegetable garden. I don't know how to grow vegetables, but like non-vegetable gardens. And it's interesting because I find, when I'm working with others, it's very hard for me to have it be a body practice because it's about interacting with others. It's hard for me to separate the two. Whereas when I'm just working, it's like there's a direction, but there's no real goal. And if I actually was trying to make a beautiful thing, with all the hours I put in, I probably would have, but it's interesting to me that it's a very personal practice, and it is all the things that you mentioned, but it necessarily interacts with conversations where people end up saying, oh, how beautiful, and what are you trying to make, and I don't know, all that kind of stuff. So just kind of an observation. I don't really know where I was going with that.
Well, it can certainly be more difficult to pay attention to the body when we are interacting with others. It's very different if we're doing a ceremony and we're all just moving together and we're not having to interact about that. But as soon as we get together and we're trying to like talk to each other and figure out stuff, then it's much more difficult, I think, to pay attention in here. How is that related or not to your experience of dance? Because you also dance with other people.
Right. Well, I'm the kind of dancer who doesn't really I love people, but I don't want to touch people when I dance. I want my space. I think because I'm not great with where I exist spatially in relation to other people. And so you bring people into it and it kind of throws me. And also, which is really funny. But when you mention being with other people, that's true, like with gardening, because then there become goals, because it's like you have to, well, what are they doing? I don't want to be like, my practice is just working with the dirt and don't necessarily try to do anything, They'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But when I don't have any gatas, but when I am digging up a lot of things, I just tell them, like, I don't know, it makes sense to me, but I say, thank you for being alive. And then of course I've just dug them up. But I think that the point is that, being connected with and in relationship with other alive things. And when I'm dancing, I am in a relationship with other alive things, but you be over there, I be over here.
Interesting. Very good. Other comments, questions, reflections this morning? Please, Robert.
I think for me, what I've learned is that when I'm not mindful, I'm kind of living in the future or living in the past, kind of creating these other worlds. And so it's like I come up with these scenarios. It's like another world and it causes me suffering. And so and a lot of times I do that when I'm doing things that aren't so pleasant. And then I come back, and when I really focus, my mind slows down and I kind of can start to enjoy things a little bit more. But that's what I think for me, mindfulness is what I've learned that does relieve my suffering. And I think that, again, that's what Buddha was teaching, relieve suffering. So that's where I found it very helpful for me in my life.
Well, certainly, when we write stories about stuff, sometimes we catastrophize. Sometimes the stories we write are, like more painful than the reality of what's in front of us. So sometimes paying attention can really help with that. So yeah, interesting. Anything else this morning? Hosshin, please.
I just want to riff on what Robert just said. I just think that the undercurrent to mindfulness is presence, being present. And it's particularly difficult to be present when it's not pleasant. And so I'm remembering back to something that Pema Chodron, I think in conversation with someone, talked, with her old teacher, Trungpa, about how somebody was going through some kind of really difficult stuff and they were just wondering how to do with it, how to feel better with it. And his advice was to relax with the discomfort, which is really hard to do. But when I think about what my work is, when I'm not fully there, that's when I hit my hand with the hammer or mark the wood or gouge the chisel too far. It's if you're not there, not constantly there. I mean, there's of course always a way or some mechanical thing out there outside of you that is reminding you to be here. But we don't like to be here sometimes. So that's just my riff on that.
So what's interesting is that we have to pay attention and be here and yet put aside small self, right?
Yeah.
I'm recalling, as you were saying that, Hosshin, I was recalling your quote when you were talking, giving your series of talks about Dharma and the arts, about how, if painting is going well, the artist has left the studio. Painting is, I don't remember the specific anymore, but if painting is going well, painting is happening, but the artist has left the room.
Right.
So somehow we have to be present with what we're doing. We have to pay attention to what we're doing, but we have to take ourselves out of that equation. So painting is painting, or zazen is doing zazen, or wood turning is doing wood turning, or dog washing is doing dog washing. So, we get to hold both of those things, which is a really interesting aspect of body practice.
Yeah.
I know when I'm singing Baika, if I can take myself out of the equation, sound is happening, I'm singing with other people, movements are happening like they're supposed to happen, but it's not about this. And for me, as somebody who has really low body awareness, golly Moses, I mean, I walk in a room, somebody else would say, oh, that picture is hanging crooked on the wall. And I would say, what, you mean there's a wall? I mean, I got no idea. I'm all up here, right? So to find a body practice that works for me, like Baika, is really helpful. And wood turning, I think, is a body practice. You know, if I'm standing in front of a wood lathe, I've got to pay attention so I don't rip my hand off. But you know, there you just can take yourself out of that and simply do what your body is doing. We've all got something like that we do. You know, it might be walking in the woods, it might be, you know, water skiing, it might be anything. But body is a really interesting Dharma gate. So many things to chew on related to that. Doju, please.
Yeah, that reminded me of what Uchiyama, says about sesshin also, this idea of sort of like relaxing in discomfort. He says you have to kind of learn not to struggle or else it will be hell. And, I think that that's one of the real values of sesshin is you really have to kind of learn to just be comfortable in your discomfort because it is not comfortable.
No, and that's so critical, right? Because I mean, the most basic fundamental parts of ourselves, we're running away from discomfort, running away from suffering, right? I mean, we just think our purpose as human beings is to run away from suffering and run towards the things we like. So, you're right, sesshin is terrific because you've committed to sitting there 14 periods a day for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, whatever it is. And so you're not going to get up and run away, but when you're on the, 12th period of zazen and your knees hurt and you're tired and you just think, what the hell am I doing this for? Yeah, you get to just sort of let go of your ideas about that discomfort because of course we want to write stories about it. And once we write stories about it, it gets worse. Can we see it clearly for what it is? Well, I'm not going to die from this. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm okay, right? Sesshin is a huge container for that kind of teaching. Did I see a hand up, Sagan or somebody? I didn't want to cut somebody off. Okay. Other things this morning? Everyone talked out? All right. Very good. Thanks for a very good discussion this morning. Really interesting. We'll go on to the other three aspects of mindfulness as our talks unfold. We have some guest speakers and closures and things happening, but the next time we come back, we'll pick up the next Dharma gate. So let's go back. Let's do our closing chant and then back to Hosshin for our announcements for today. Thank you.